And I think we can begin. It's 9:03. That's my rule. 3 minutes into it, I start. So, Diane, is it okay if I'm going to tee this off? And all right. So, hello, my name is Erez, batat. I want to welcome everyone to this conversation that Diane, Sherman, and myself are going to have in your presence. Yeah, so maybe I'll start by introducing myself, and then Diane, you can introduce yourself, and we can just dive in from there. And I'll talk a little bit about the topic for which we've convened here today. So, as I said, my name is Erez Batat. I currently live in Israel, but I used to live in the United States for about 22 years. And 13 of these years, I was married, 13, right? Oh, maybe, yeah, 13. I was married to Diane, to lovely Diane, who's my best friend today. Even though that we don't live under the same, the exact same sky, and not the same continent, we still chat regularly, and we're family. So we had a wonderful, wonderful marriage, and we've learned a lot from each other. And one of the things I've learned from Diane throughout our relationship, it was very, very engaging relationship. We taught each other many, many things, but one of the things that she taught me that I can definitely say that when I walked into the relationship, I knew nothing about is art. And in fact, there's a story there, because I was kind of like poo-pooing art, and art is, you know, like, who goes to a museum? Like, what's the point, you know? And so that's kind of, you know, where I went in. And of course, you know, Diane saw different things. And, you know, now looking back, it's weird because I am an artist in many different ways, not just when I go on, you know, in front of the camera and, you know, speak about different things. I lecture and I teach. And some of these teachings I do under different hats, you know, sort of alter egos, things like that. So you can say that in some way I'm somewhat of a performer, but also I write. So art comes in many different forms, and speaking is one of them, and writing is one of them. And Diane, of course, concentrates on the visual art, but she'll speak about herself. So why don't you take this, Diane, and introduce yourself and say anything that I haven't said, and then maybe we'll kind of present the topic.
How far do you want me to go?
I'm an open book.
Let's just say we had a very dynamic relationship, and we still do. And the thing about Erez and me is that we, and those of you in Israel probably know this, that we think really differently. Like, we literally think so differently. I'm a complete visual thinker. I see things in my head, and he can't see anything in his head. And so it became this communication challenge for us. And I just want to bring that up because I think that it's interesting in terms of your relationship to visual art, that you weren't really that interested in visual art. He couldn't even remember what I looked like if I was gone for 2 weeks. So, you know, like, very different. And then I'm just like, oh, I can see everything in my mind. And that's actually how I write. Like, I write poetry, and I write, you know, short stories, and I pretty much see things and just describe it. So it's really thrilling to bring Israel and America together. Those of you who don't know me, I'm a crier. I'm already going to cry, so I have to get a tissue, and that's just who I am. So I'll be right back.
Right. And then, you know, so I'm going to speak a little bit, just a tiny bit, about what Diane just said, that I can't see anything in my mind's eye, in my imagination. And for those of you who haven't heard about this state of consciousness, shall we say, it is a congenital state of mind. It has a name. It's called aphantasia, but it's not an issue. I mean, it's kind of a bad name because it suggests that I cannot fantasize, but aphantasia, but it's not true. I fantasize perfectly. I just do it in the dark. And there's about 3-4% of the population that are blind in their imagination. And in fact, the story, it was officially discovered in 2014, 2015 by somebody in the University of Essex, Dr. Adam Zeman. And, you know, in 2012, about 2 years before that, I remember Diane and I were sitting on the couch on a Friday night, and, you know, we were just snuggling on the couch, and she was saying, "Oh, I see pink elephants. They're dancing." And, you know, because pink elephants are not a real thing, so, you know, I knew she's not looking somewhere in the room to see pink elephants. I was like, something just hit me differently. And for the first time in my life, it clicked that she means that she actually sees something in her mind's eye, because we have only access to our own consciousness. And I was like, hold on, where do you see it? And she's like, what do you mean? In my imagination. It's like, well, do you always see things in your mind? Like, it was just mind-boggling to me. And after that discovery, it was a lot more logical to me. First of all, why she loves the visual art so much, but second, where she gets her muse from, because, you know, Diane, you see things in your mind and then you paint them. And, you know, I can't paint for the life of me. I mean, you put a gun to my head, I couldn't paint a matchstick man. So, yeah. So, you know, the topic of arts and consciousness is kind of complex. Dan, you know, you have your own background in arts and consciousness. I'm interested in it from the perspective of consciousness evolution. In Hebrew, the word omanud means art. Comes from the same root of the word lehitamen, omanut lehitamen, which means practice. That means you cannot do art without practicing, which we all know. Same root. And if you switch two of the letters, just switch their location, omanut, onamut, switch the two middle letter, it means art or die. So art is a very fundamental building block, I think, when it comes to consciousness evolution. And I think that today our purpose and our goal here is to express that in different ways. Some of it's going to be based on just topics that Diane and I want to talk about, and some of it's going to be based on a few questions that were submitted by you guys. So anything to add, Diane?
Yeah, so what I didn't do is I didn't really give a little bit of my own background.
Please.
I sort of about our relationship, which has really been instrumental in my own evolution of my consciousness. But I do want to let you guys, you know, just know a little bit about me. I've been a creative. I mean, I think we're all creatives, but I've been someone practicing movement, writing, and visual art since I was young. And I've loved all three modalities for different reasons. Like the movement helps me get in my body. The writing helps me express the mind, which is really, you know, the universal language where we converse through language with each other. And then the visual art is about, for me, my thought is that it's really about expressing the feelings. You know, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words, right? And so I've always felt like I should choose one of these modalities and really focus, but I could never do it. So over 40 years, I've just been moving from movement and dance and yoga, and then writing and poetry and, you know, reading and writing, and then to the visual art. And my biggest practice, and I love that you said that, Erez, about art and practice, that now, like, my practice is to show up, and not just now, but I've been journaling for over 40 years, both writing and a visual art journal. That has really been the way to work with my own consciousness. And so I'm going to share some of that. And then, you know, I have a master's in arts and consciousness. I got it about 25 years ago. And I didn't even know what it meant at the time. I was like, arts and consciousness, what is that? I think I have to do that. And it was back in the 90s when it was like, what is consciousness? You know? And prior to that, my undergraduate is in art history. And so I studied the masters, and I studied essentially these painters throughout history who were expressing the collective consciousness of their time. And then there would be these shifts in consciousness, and the artists generally, you know, in general, we can even think about it today, that artists tend to be on the edge of society, right? They are expressing the collective consciousness that sometimes doesn't want to be seen or heard. And so often they're people who are marginalized for their ideas because it's like, I don't know, we don't want to look at that, you know, we don't want to deal with that. But, and then later, usually, you know, 50 years later, 100 years later, 500 years later, it seems so obvious because we put it in the context of the time. So that's just a little bit of a nutshell of context. And I think it leads into the question, one of the questions that came through to Erez in his community was, what is art, right? It's a huge question. What is art? And so, you know, that's been, I think, being tried to be answered for millennium. But for myself, I'll take a stab at it. And maybe Erez, you want to take a stab at it. But from my perspective, art is about shifting consciousness. Like at the very root, art is about helping us see something seen from a new perspective. You know, like let's take the artist who is offering a new perspective or a social commentary or taking something out of context, like Marcel Duchamp, who was a French artist who took the toilet and put it in an art show and pretty much was like, okay, this is an art piece, this mundane object where everybody uses, right? And it's this shift of consciousness. And so I think art is about shifting consciousness. I think it also is an expression, it can be an expression of beauty, like just the pure soulfulness of expressing this human existence, the sort of awe that we want to try to capture, that is very ephemeral and intangible, like we can't hold it. So art is also about that. I know I feel that, I try to capture the flower, and like just the flowers themselves are their own art piece, right? But that's nature. And then I think art makes us feel something, like art evokes something, even if it's a negative response, or even if it's a rejection of an idea, it's evoking something in us that moves us to think about something differently. And when I say art, and Erez, I kind of want to establish this with our conversation, like there's visual art, there's writing, there's dance, there's music, like I'm including all of those art forms. So not just the visual. Yeah. What do you think? Like, how would you define art?
Yeah, so, of course, I'm trying to be a little scientific about it. And I'm asking myself, what's the objective definition of art? And it's really hard because you can go to a garage sale and see somebody who's like, oh yeah, here's art. And they show you something that you look at and say, well, that's not art. That's just, something that looks like somebody did a, fourth grade, art class, right? But is it art, right? And I think that when I try to pinpoint what is the common denominator of all art, there's a few things that come to mind. The first thing is that, as I said before, art requires practice. There's some kind of skill that is involved. Even if you have a talent for something, you still have to practice in order for your art to be good. And that's true for all forms of art. The one more thing is that for somebody to do art, there has to be some kind of presence in the moment. You cannot do art without presence in the moment. I don't care what art it is, you cannot do art without being present in the moment. There's something about that presence that you're channeling through something that is very critical. Another piece of the puzzle is art has some kind of an idea that you're expressing in physical form. There has to be something physical for art to be established. If you have art in your mind, in your imagination, it's not art, it's just an idea, it's potential, but for it to become art, there has to be something physical to happen. And for something physical to happen, you need to be, it has to happen in the present. So you have to use your hands. You have to, you have to write. I can have the best story in my head, but if I didn't sit down and write it, then it does not exist. And the last thing that comes to mind for me when I think about art is that there's always some kind of an abstract idea that is expressed through some form of a metaphor, right? I mean, you look at a few flowers, and Diane, you were saying you're trying to capture something that is reality, but there's something about these flowers that one of them, maybe just as an example, maybe is a little bit down, looks really sad, and the other one is looks like it's high, right? So you're trying to capture that. There's some message, and there's art, and I think you're going to show something to that extent. There's a lot of art that sends political messages, right? So there's some kind of an abstract message that is being delivered through a physical media, right? In some way, shape, or form. And I think that when we take all these together, then we really get a tool for expressing something, expressing some kind of emotion. And I think this is why art, and I'm sure, Diane, you're going to be talking about it because that's what you do. Art is also an extremely powerful tool to express emotion and to unload things. I know that for me, writing, when I write about, it doesn't matter, I write a book right now, I'm almost done with it. It's a novel, it's in Hebrew, and I'm almost at the end. And there is no one character that I don't identify with in some way, shape, or form. And the process is sometimes brutal, because there's an emotional expression that is coming from my mind to my fingers that are typing it in. And then I feel better because something was unloaded. So that's a lot. But, I think trying to summarize all those things that are defining art objectively, right? So
okay, but there's a great comment in the chat from Elad that that isn't art just self-expression? A child also does art, but as a grown-up, it's something else. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I want to talk to that for a minute, because I think there's a disconnect between the two words creative and an artist, right? And Erez, what you're talking to is the practice of skillfulness, that we have to show up and practice our craft, right? So to become an artist or a writer or a musician, you have to show up and practice your craft, because there is skill involved, just like there is skill involved in becoming a doctor or an engineer or a teacher. But we are all creative, and the child that accesses that ability to draw and play, like in my own workshops, like I try to take people back to that inner 7-year-old where we know exactly what to do to find the freedom and the looseness, the scribbling and the play with color and the pure expression, which I think is what you're talking about in a self-expression, but then to actually become art and to really have it be somewhat a skillful piece of art, right? It takes practice. Does that?
So it sounds like, the term art contains many different things, right? An action, right? A child doing art, but also an art piece, because that what constitutes an art piece, right? So, you're talking, and then there's creativity. So it's a little tricky, but, I think maybe we can narrow it down by talking about art as a tool of consciousness, because that kind of focuses what we're talking about, maybe.
So let's do that. So I would love to share, I decided to choose a few examples of artists so they were a married couple. They're Mexican artists. Some of you may know them, Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. And like major Mexican artists who helped shift consciousness in the time that they were or alive. So should we just dive into that? Because like a lot of the, the conversation is, how do we use art as a tool to shift consciousness, right? How do we actually use art? So I'm gonna share my screen and let me go here. Hang on, bear with me.
Diane, may I ask you a quick question?
Yes.
Shifting consciousness, you mean ours or the viewers or potential viewers or both? Whose consciousness are we trying to shift?
Thank you. That's a great question. And I'm going to address that. Well, hang on, sorry. I'm going to address that as we go. So one is an artist working with the collective consciousness. So in culture, in society, right? So there's that, the artist trying to have an impact on society and the way they think and or move through the world. And then there's also the very personal, how to shift our own consciousness and to use art and creativity. And I would, like, I teach art journaling and I teach creative process as a means to shift our consciousness and as a way to gain access to seeing things in a new way. So, like, great question. So I'm just going to start here. So just to say, this is a piece of my own art. This was done in 2020, and I chose to start with this because it's 4th of July weekend here in the United States. And, I'm sure all of you know, like, it just feels like our country is sort of falling apart, and the very values on which it, I don't know, like, it's such a complicated question, but this to me was the new flag that I painted 2 years ago in 2020. And it's called We the People, because, we are needing to represent like who we really are. And so this was my effort to say, this old paradigm doesn't really work, like this whole top-down, patriarchal, very white, legislated kind of consciousness that we have in the US. Like, it's not what is happening, and we are in a massive time of a shift of consciousness, period, around the world. I think, in Israel, you've just had a big, new upheaval of your own government, right? So anyway, that's my art. And then so here's Diego Rivera. And Diego Rivera, he was one of the most famous Mexican artists, and he created these huge murals with a lot of the theme about the working class in Mexico and the struggles of the poor. And he really wanted to impact, so this answers this question, right? He wanted to impact his culture and the world's perspective of like these poorer working class Mexican people and their own struggles. And so through his beautiful images, he was able to, in very public places, have these stories told about the laborer and the workers and what was happening for them in that time. So he was really trying to socialize the artistic expression. And, in the prior century, so he was, in the early 20th century, he died in the 50s. Art was often very much for the elite, and he's kind of moving this to more of like, art is for the masses and to have the stories told and to have awareness, shown through the stories of art. So here's another one of his pictures of just, this common woman making tortillas, and his simple forms and his kind of more simple palette was also a fairly revolutionary thing in Mexican art at the time. So I'm gonna show you guys one of his murals. So this is one of his many, many, many murals. He did quite a number of murals in the San Francisco Bay Area, also in Chicago. So like his work is, you can see here, there is the indigenous roots of the Mexican people. He's speaking to really a lot of the indigenous roots, and then the natural world. And it's like this much more holistic vision of life and historically of his own culture. So he's again trying to tell the stories and bring it around to having people be aware of these. So he was married to Frida, and Frida, this is Frida here in her bed painting. And she was an incredibly, and is still, very celebrated Mexican artist. Her work was much more personal because she did a lot of self-portraits. You know, she was working with themes of identity and nationalism and gender and class and race. And she also was working with her own severe pain that came from an accident where she had like a pole ran up through her body and had her lying in bed. And you can see here, she's literally painting from her bed. So very autobiographical. Her work is very autobiographical. And I chose these two because, you know, they're super powerful and well-known Mexican painters, but they were also married. And I thought, you know, thematically, it's kind of nice. It's like, oh, here, you know, Erez and I are really together, still working on our own path, but supporting one another. And there's something about the relationship between Frida and Diego that was passionate and intense and really challenging. So here's an image she painted. Here's this rod right up through her body. And she painted from her, as you saw, she painted from her bed. And she often mixed fantasy and surrealism and questions about her own identity, especially as a woman, especially as a, you know, a woman who's lost her ability to move and feel beautiful in her own body. And she was a powerhouse. This is a painting where she's like the two Fridas. And this is a quote I found. She once said she suffered two great accidents. The one was the street accident that left her back broken and her pelvis fractured and her foot crushed. And then the other was Diego, who was so devoted, and yet, you know, this philandering husband for her, which was just so much of a heartache for her. So, you know, here she is working with the very real organ of the heart, but, you know, working on her own, like this is her internalized world coming out through her paintings and sharing some of that deep pain through image and metaphor. So I'm going to take you to so here is the shift, right? Frida was an avid journaler. She was an avid journaler, and her journal, there's a book, I have her book that is her journal. And she really worked it out in her journal. She did, you know, a lot of writing. She did a lot of self-reflection. She did a lot of painting in her journals. And it was a way for her to work through her pain and to work out ideas and to work out what she's manifesting in her next paintings. And so it was like the journal is this really powerful dynamic. Oh yeah, Renat, thank you. She suffered from polio. Thank you. I'm just looking in the chat here. Oh yeah, thank you. It's nice. Frida's, yes. That's awesome, you guys. Thanks for, keep putting in the chat. That's great. So here's another one of Frida's journals. You can see she's writing, and then she's got these images. It's sort of like, oh, are these her? Are they someone else? And so where I want to take this is I'm going to share some of my journal. So I have been journaling for, you know, probably 40 years. And this is my journal last year when I got COVID. And I got COVID and I had long haul COVID, and it was so brutal. Like I just felt like my lungs were burning and I was on fire. And these were the things, these little messages: rest, receive, let go, trust. Like I could not go to the store for 2 months. I was so tired. My lungs were on fire. And I'm like, oh my God. And so I had to practice as an independent, very sort of willful person. I had to practice receiving and letting go and trusting. And, you know, this is another journal page where I'm like, okay, I'm just gonna like keep practicing. And then I would like write these little messages to myself, like, let go, it's okay. Like, trust, it's okay. Like, okay, you can't hold on. Like, life is going to teach you what you need to learn. And that is what is happening now, you guys, to our whole world. We are all being tested to this level to step up to whatever our own consciousness needs to learn, right? So, you know, this is why I love the journal, because it's sort of this constant, steady documentation, but in a fun way that feels like, oh, I'm having a conversation with myself and my consciousness, and then my higher self. So I'm going to show a few more images. This is, you know, there's a lot of grief right now. And this is a page this is when my stepfather died. Erez and I were just coming to the conclusion that we were going to get divorced. We were starting to talk about letting go of the home that we lived in, that we both loved. And I sat on a plane going to visit my mother right after my stepfather died. And I literally sat there and I scribbled this. I just kept running the pen and left this little tiny hole in the middle of the page. And then I just scribbled and scribbled and scribbled and scribbled. I kind of wondered what the person next to me thought, because I'm like, that person's like, woo, she's a little off. But I'm like, oh my God, you know, it was a way to get the grief out of my body. And then this too is just another sort of very free form expression of like chaos and uncertainty. And like right now, we just have so much uncertainty and so much fear and anxiety. And this journaling practice for me has been this incredible grounding place to explore not just all the feelings, but, you know, the visions of what I want to manifest. And, you know, here's one that is the gratitude, bringing in the light. Like we can find the gratitude even in the darkest moments. Like in my COVID time, like I became extremely grateful for my garden, and then just sitting and actually having time to just be and getting off the little hamster wheel. So, you know, it's a place to have those conversations as well. So I'm going to stop the share there for a minute. But I think that, so for me, going back to what Erez said, as having a practice, I think as creative people, and we are all creative. We are all creative. We are literally creating our lives every minute of the day with the thoughts we have, with the words that we speak, and then with the actions that we bring forward into the world. And yet, to cultivate a skillful creative practice is a little different. It's like, you have to show up as the writer, like Erez has been showing up to write his novel. I mean, we have to show up to, you know, learn the skillfulness of painting and drawing. And yet we can do it in this fun, explorative way. So Erez, do you want to pop in with, so I hope that, like, if you guys have any thoughts or questions about what I've just said too, please drop that. Let's see. Is there an example of shifting your own consciousness using the creative process? So Michael, yeah, I'm hoping that what I just said helped explain that. Do you feel like that kind of explained it? Because absolutely, like, I feel like I've shifted my own consciousness using the creative practices that I have. And then one more thing, part of writing too is the ownership of our stories. And when we own our stories, like these little parts of ourselves that we, like, I have a book coming out in this fall probably, and it's 108 stories. And it's the ownership of all these little bits of myself that are the inner world as well as the outer world, like what happened in the outer world, but then the inner world. And I think when we own our stories and we stand with, yeah, I did that. And yeah, here's what I learned. And now it's integrated. And once we own the story, nobody can really throw us off center. Because who here, like, put it in the chat, who here has not fucked up in life? Seriously, anybody? Like, because if you are, I want to know you, and I want to know your secret, because there's not a person here who hasn't made a mistake, who hasn't felt shame. I guarantee it. If not, you're lying to yourself. So, you know, it's like, yeah, we go through this stuff and it's hard. And the ownership is the liberation. The ownership is the key to liberating yourself. Whether you write a book or not, but just to own the stories. I'm like, yeah. So anyway, Mike, I hope that helps that answer.
Michael, did you want to say something?
You.
You unmuted yourself. All right, you're writing in the chat.
No, thanks. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. All right, so you know, I think Dan, thank you for this. I think I'm going to add to what Michael said. Is there an example of shifting your own consciousness using the creative process? One of the questions that was pre-submitted was, can you talk about art as a tool for consciousness development? And I want to give a little context, because what is consciousness development, right? So there's a few things we can talk about. The first thing is there's something called the primordial wound, the birth wound, the spiritual wound. And there's many names for it, but it's basically the wound that we get from our parents, whether it's poverty consciousness or whether it's victim mentality or whatever. And usually so, or addiction, you know, there's all kinds of things that are literally passing throughout the generations, basically, you know, the way our parents fucked us up, right? And, you know, we have the ability to fix it. We have the ability to let go of it, and we have the ability to improve it sometimes a little bit. And the idea is that when we do that, the next generation is slightly, you know, we're going to screw them up in some kind of a different way, but there's obviously a collective development of consciousness that is happening from one generation to another. If we look 100 years ago, you know, hysteria was a disease that only women suffered from, right? It was a condition, literally a condition. And, you know, I mean, I was hysterical this morning, right? So the idea is that there is the individual consciousness evolution, and then there's the collective consciousness evolution. And for example, when we get to the midlife, right? Women between 30, 40 type of thing, men between 35, 45, there's an opportunity to shed our old self, that, you know, this shell that we've established in our youth, and basically create a different individual out of ourselves, out of the misery, out of, you know, the lotus from the mud. And I think that in this particular case, art becomes an extremely powerful tool. And I see it in so many ways. And I'll give a couple of examples. The first one is I do these workshops for people who suffer from cannabis dependency. And in the workshops, I ask them to express the inner child that wants to smoke all the time versus the inner adult that doesn't want to smoke at all. And some of the things that people do are amazing. Just the letters they're writing to themselves. Sometimes the letters they write to cannabis, thanking it, you know, because when you thank something, it's easier to let it go. This person in the workshop I'm doing right now, he's rapping. Every time I'm asking them to do something, he's rapping about it. And so there is some kind of an expression that is happening and allowing us to release it. And I think that one of the pieces in art that is so meaningful is that when we do art, we remember it. There's some kind of a process that is happening, and we internalize the emotion and the narrative that is associated with it. And I'm going to give an anecdotal reference from Kabbalah. In Kabbalah, or Kabbalah, as they say in the United States, in Kabbalah, there's the tree of life, and the tree of life has these 3 triangles. And the idea is that the energy that goes in, that comes to us, is essentially divided into the masculine and feminine in our mind, right? And the masculine is the narrative, the feminine is everything else, is everything that is happening in the present, right? The sensation, the imagination. And, then it continues, in whatever imbalance, because some people are more, we say left brain, right brain, it continues into the emotional realm. And in the emotional realm, you're either, expressing emotion in a more, we'll call it active, powerful, male, quote unquote, fashion, or more passive, more, what's called in Kabbalah, the female aspect, sort of like in electricity, right? Not to take it into gender identity and all these things. And then whatever wasn't expressed goes down to action and to sexuality, but that's a different topic. And in Kabbalah, the idea is that only when you marry the two, the narrative that's associated with the emotion and the sensation itself, only then you can let it go. And if you think about it, that's the reason we go to psychologists and therapists, because we need to associate some kind of narrative. We need to, that emotion I've been feeling that's grief. I'm grieving something or someone, or I'm grieving a whole phase in my life that I've let go. I'm grieving my marriage, for example. And when you're speaking about it, then you're able to let it go. And in Kabbalah, it's called the upper union. And I think that when we do art, there's this way of, you have something you want to say, and sometimes it's a narrative, sometimes it's not, but sometimes it's a narrative. And when you express it, that union is happening. And not only you remember it better, but also you can release it. And when you release, it's like some of Diane's painting and other painting, when you release something into a book, into a painting, into a dance, doesn't matter what your art is, people can see it. They can usually feel that same emotion, or maybe it invokes a different emotion in them, but they can see it, they can feel it. And I think that in this way, art can become an amazing tool for self-development, because it allows us to A, release, and B, build something new within ourselves.
Okay,
Erez, can I ask?
I have to jump in there. Oh, sorry, Michael.
Michael, yeah.
Thank you. Can I just ask you a question? You said, what are the two halves? When you let go of the narrative connected to the emotion, and what was the other half?
Well, I'm saying there's the emotion, essentially everything that's experienced in real time, in the present. There's imagine that you have a particular sensation. It's like, there's this feeling, Mr. Psychiatrist, I don't know what it is, but I feel this and I feel that. And the psychiatrist is trying to get you to essentially understand what is going on by verbalizing it. And when, I'll give you an actual example. There's a podcast I have called Kabbalistic Mystic. In one of the episodes, the interviewee is talking to me about a particular emotion that he's having. And then, when I realized what he's talking, I was talking about anxiety. And I was saying that anxiety is usually sensed as some kind of a knot in the diaphragm right here below, in this place. And he started crying. And I said, why are you crying? And he said, because for the first time, I know what I'm suffering from. And so these are in Kabbalah, it's called the upper union, associating narrative with the actual sensation. And when you do that, you can let it go. You can start letting it go because you know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
All right, so I want to jump in because there's a poem I pulled for today, and it totally references what you're talking about. And also this idea of like left brain, right brain, but skillfulness in terms of artistic expression versus just pure play expression. And both are valid, but listen to this. So you guys, you can sit back, shut your eyes. This is by Mark Nepo. He is a modern day poet, philosopher. He's amazing. It's called Art Lesson. The mind moves like a pencil. The heart moves like a brush. While the mind can draw exquisite prints, the heart, with its deep, bright colors, will ignore the lines. If you only follow your mind, you will never go outside the lines. If you only follow your heart, what you touch will never resemble anything. We must be a student of both, for the mind can build itself a home, but only the heart can live in it. So that's essentially what you said, Erez. It's like this left-right brain union. And this is what happened for Erez. So just going back to our marriage, I am so right brain and he is so left brain. And we were literally like, oh my God, what are you saying? I don't understand. And yet over time, you know, we really found the appreciation for this other. And I think, you know, this really, like in my opinion, this is what we are being pulled forward towards in consciousness right now, is to all of us bring forth and work on that union of both the masculine and the feminine within ourselves, so that we can participate in the world as fully as possible. Does that make sense?
Then, you know, it makes sense to me. I think that maybe that's a good point to include a couple of stories. Maybe you want to tell the Paris story, and I'll tell the other story, another story.
Yes, but I just have to read Michael's thing. I understand Erez much better than Diane because of that. He just wrote in the chat. It's like some of us, right? We understand one way of thinking so much better. And other people are like, oh my God, why don't I understand this person? I like them, but I don't understand them. Yeah. You know, fascinating.
So, you know, this may be a good opportunity to say to Michael and to some other people, I'm going to take this advantage to invite you to, you know, Michael, you specifically, because the way I speak, you know, if it makes sense to you logically and about what's happening in the mind and all that stuff, then I want to invite you to this free talk that I'm going to be doing on July 24th, Sunday. And I'm going to write the link to register in the chat to get the link to join. But it's basically a talk about mental blindness, aphantasia. What it is it, and what other mental senses it impacts. And the reason I'm mentioning it here, Michael, is because one of the things I'll do in that lecture, I'll talk about I'll talk about the mind versus the brain and the way we perceive reality. And I think it's going to tie off a lot of things that we're speaking about here. So how aphantasia works on July 24th, it's going to be 10 a.m. PST, 8 p.m. Israel time, and I'll put the link. It's aphantasia.me. In order to register, I'll put it right now in the chat. So Diane, back to you.
I'm like, what were we saying?
You want to tell the Paris story about how clueless I was about art?
Oh yeah. So, okay. So here's a personal story. We're in Paris, you know, lucky to be in Paris together. And I'm like, oh my God, there's so many incredible museums. We're going to go to the museums. And he's like, wow, how long do we have to go to the museums? I'm like, okay, come on. So we go to, if you've been in l'Orangerie, which is, you know, one of the big museums in Paris, and it has the Impressionists and like some of my favorite artists who I had studied. And so we decided that I would be Erez's sort of tour guide on giving him the social, economic, and political context of the paintings, so that when he looked at them, there was, it wasn't just like, oh, here's this painting of like a railroad and some people and, you know, own the brush strokes or like this. Who cares about the brush strokes? Well, how does it relate to, first of all, not just the you know, the social, political, and economic time, but how does it contextually relate to the prior era of art? So anyway, I won't go into all the details, but I took him through, right? And you started to see the power of art, that the artists were expressing the social, political, economic context of the time and the evolution of consciousness breaking out from the prior era of how art was done, mainly for the elite, and then that it was going into a broader social context and kind of becoming more art for art's sake in its own way. And so I think with that, you know, you want to tell, this is just a little context, but tell your side of like how it impacted.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in a household where there was always two paintings on the wall, the exact same paintings all throughout my life. One was a macrame thing that I think somebody weaved in the house, you know, that you get this, you know what I'm talking about? You get this like sort of like an image of something, and you weave in yarn in order to make the colors. And so that was one thing, and it was like a Mona Lisa thing. And then, you know, another something that somebody did in the family, and that's it. And nobody really looked at them. I mean, it was just there, and the walls, like in all the rooms, were always bare. And the idea of going to a museum was just like a nightmare to me, because all my museum visits were so boring. And I think, Diane, for the first time when I was with you in that museum, and it took a lot for me to be like, okay, fine, you know, it's like, oh my God, I married this woman, now she's going to want to go to art museums every time we go to a big city. You know, what have I done? You know, and we're in Paris, it's supposed to be a big deal. All right, fine, you know, and she was just like, come on, Erez, you know, just give me an hour. And if you don't like it, I promise not going to happen again. Like, just give me 1 hour, 2 hours, whatever. And it worked. It worked because you gave me a story. And I think, Michael, this goes back to what you were saying. You know, suddenly I had a narrative with all these arts, and there was a story behind them. And, you know, just like Dan, you were saying before, I think was a great example that until a particular point, art was only for the elite. And here you have this artist that goes and paints the difficulties of the, you know, of the common man. And there's this art period where art was self-portraits of people. And the more accurate you did them, the better. And, you know, suddenly somebody comes, Picasso, you know, doing cubes. Cubism was Picasso, or am I screwing this up? Yes, okay, fine. See, it's like, so suddenly I discover I'm married to an art history person, and she tells me all these things, and I'm starting to like it, right? And then a few years later, I'm just going to add my own little story here. So I was a very different person. I was, you know, sort of calling myself an Israeli redneck. And one of the things I was, I had like a big safe in the house, and I had guns, and, you know, all the good stuff, right? And I remember one time just this idea of connecting to an art piece was so foreign to me. And this one time I wanted to get Diane a present, and I figured I'll go to an art gallery and I look at the paintings and I'll see if I connect to something. And I never had that connection. I never looked at a painting and said, I'm willing to spend money on this thing. Like, it just looked to me like such a waste of money. And then I go to this gallery and I look at paintings, like, yeah, boring. Wow, what a waste of money. Fine, you know. And then suddenly I look at a particular painting, and I don't know why, I have no idea. It was just a painting of this barn in this, you know, in the Palisades, you know, a local artist in Spokane. And there was something about it that just hit me. And I knew I wanted to buy that painting. And until that moment, never, ever it happened to me that I wanted to spend money on a painting. The problem was the painting was a lot of money. And I'm like, that's not what I wanted to spend on the gift. What do I do? And so I went back home and I sold all my guns, each and every gun, because I was like, for a while there, they were just sitting in my safe. Why do I have these guns? Sort of like this this thing that's just waiting for the day that it's going to justify its existence. And I don't want that day to come. Like, why do I need these guns? Like, I don't feel unsafe to the point that I need a gun in my house. I have a pit bull, you know, like it's just.
Wait long enough.
What's that?
You didn't wait long enough and stay in the US long enough.
Right. And so I went, I sold all my guns and I bought Diane the painting. It doesn't matter that she didn't connect with it like I did, but, you know, the point of the story is, you know, it was this meaningful thing. And from that day, I think I connected with the idea in the meeting of having art on the wall and this concept of seeing a beautiful things and something beautiful and adding value in terms of the making your environment beautiful. I mean, look at Diane's room. I mean, it's beautiful. And I just didn't have that in my life. So thank you, Diane, for bringing that into my life, among other things, of course, like yoga.
Oh, yeah. Well, listen, I just want you to know I did connect with that painting, and it's the Palouse. And,
Palouse,
you know,
yeah. Right.
Palouse is this beautiful area in Washington. And of course, you know, I was so detached that he would sell all the guns, which I didn't really like having in the house anyway. And I was perimenopausal, so I was really glad they were in a safe. So ladies, you know, I'm sure some of you might relate to, like, oh my God, the perimenopausal craziness. Yeah. So thank you. I want to check in if there's, you know, because we're going to go another 15 minutes just to let you guys know if you need to go or anything. Couple things, you know, I'd love to know if there's more questions. We have a couple more questions, Erez, that, you know.
Yeah. So if you want, I can read a couple.
Yeah, and if there's also any pressing questions, let's see, truly a shift in consciousness. Yeah, Kelly's saying truly a shift in consciousness. Absolutely. And you know what? It's like, that's actually what Erez and I helped each other do. We helped each other in our relationship shift our consciousness. Like I really began to see the value of all the structure and logic, basically in that art lesson poem, like all the pencil work and all of the structure that then is what we have to practice. And he really saw the value. There it is. That's the painting. Yeah. So that was hanging above our mantle in our home. And I still have it hanging in the house, in my house, which is, you know, he comes to visit. So truly a shift of consciousness, you know. And I think this, you know, we're just touching the scratching the surface on these questions because, you know, like I have a master's in arts and consciousness, and art and ritual and the practice of making art is a practice of shifting our consciousness and shifting the world consciousness. And one thing I do really want to say is, like, I believe if we all tapped into our own innate creativity and expressed what we are here to express, whether that's in, you know, the form of writing a poem or doing visual art, or maybe it's in like being the best engineer ever, or being the best, you know, lawyer who's going to, you know, bring about a different legal structure. Like whatever our form of creativity is, like we're all here to become ourselves. And I think this is, for me, the biggest message about creating our lives is we have to make the choices to bloom into who we are, not who we think we should be, nor comparing mind to try to be someone we're not, you know? So I do also, you know, Erez has invited you to a few things. I have a Facebook group I just started. It's called The Inspired Creative. And it's about unlocking the wisdom within. And you know, you're welcome to join in there.
Dan, maybe you want to put the link to the Facebook group in the chat.
Yeah.
And meanwhile, I'll read another question. There was another question from, and I'm sorry, I apologize to all those who submitted questions in my community in Israel, in the group. ahead of time. We're probably not going to go through all the questions, but one of the questions was, how does the process of consciousness evolution happens in art? And we spoke about that from the perspective of the artist, but I think that the question is also asking about the viewer, the one who enjoys the art. And that relates to another question that was asked about that connection between the artist and the person who is experiencing the art. And it was somewhat of an abstract question, Diane, if you remember, we spoke about it. But there was a question about meaning. You know, it's like, oh, the artist has, for example, I'm writing this book right now. And obviously there's messages I want to express. One of my characters is, he's a criminal. He does things that shouldn't be done. But he's really a lost soul. And through the story, I'm trying to show the similarities between him and the main character, the other character who's the good guy, so to speak, the antagonist versus the protagonist, and to show that they're not that different, right? And so there's an underlying message, and my hope is that when the reader reads this, they'll learn to judge him less throughout the story, right? And I have no idea if that's going to happen. I mean, when I give my story to people to read, I have people who read it and say, oh my God, I hate this character. And some people say, oh my God, I love this character, right? And so I think that there's always some form of intent. Maybe Diane can expand on that, but I think it's sort of, you're sending your message out there and you're hoping that it's going to strike a chord. And if it does, great. And if it doesn't, what are you going to do, right?
Okay, so we got a dog action here, but yeah. So this is a huge question because, sorry guys, dog. Who do we make art for, right? Who do we make art for, and what kind of impact do we want to have? Well, over all these years, like decades of making art, I recognize that, first of all, everybody who looks at your art, sees your art, reads your art, listens to your art, they bring themselves, all of their own personal experience and the lenses that they're working with and their own blindsidedness that they're not going to see in necessarily the way that you are writing or making your art. So we truly, like, it's again, my thing is like, we just have to do it for ourselves. Like, we make it for ourselves. And then whoever resonates with it and whoever it speaks to, there's our audience. But if we are going to twist, and I've spent a lifetime of twisting myself into someone for you to like, oh, I want to make sure everybody's happy and content and blah, blah, blah. It's like, well, that's just exhausting. And so until we shed all those layers of trying to be someone we're not, and particularly in our art, like my art right now feels really messy and it's kind of like scratchy. And like, I'm like, not sure I like it, but I feel like it relates to what is being lived right now. It's a gnarly time, you know? And I just also want to say, like, I'm putting out this book that's coming out soon, and it feels really scary. It's really scary to put out these stories that I'm like, oh, if you're a hardcore Christian person who is pro-life, well, you're not really going to appreciate my story of a young woman who made the choice to have an abortion. It's a really tough one. It's like, okay, but what am I going to do? Censor myself? No, I'm not. I'm not going to censor myself anymore. I have already done that. And we have to get over censoring ourselves for other people's comfort, The internal censor, no. Sorry, I'm like, what is happening in our country has stirred me beyond, it's like, wow. And this is where like all of our voices have to be heard. Like the real truth, not like the, oh, copacetic, we can all sit at the dinner table and nobody's going to get upset. And that's why I love Israeli culture. I loved being married to Erez for that. It's like, it's so much more in your face. It's so much more real. There's just something about Americans, and I'm just going to call it, that, you know, we're just so like, oh, let's not upset anybody, you know? So,
you know, I think there's advantages and disadvantages. I'll give you an example. You know, I go to both English-based media and Hebrew-based media online, and the chat, you know, the chat on news outlets and things like that is a lot more violent here in Israel. And it's a more violent place, period. I mean, not just politically, but also socially. And so there's a downside to this in your face thing, because, you know, I want to go back and add to what you're saying about this expression, because it's really true. When you're expressing yourself, when you're doing art, you're really putting your emotions and your experience and everything that you know basically in front of everyone. Because if you're writing a scene that, let's say, has sexual tension in it, then, you know, when you're writing it, you're not thinking to yourself, oh, this individual who I do not know, who's going to buy my book, what is he going to be thinking about me? No, you're thinking about, what is my dad going to be thinking about? What's my mom going to be? What is my aunt going to be? Like, the people who know me are going to be reading this and say, oh, this is what comes to his mind? Has he experienced this? Has he, wow, what a sick mind, or what an amazing mind, or I didn't think that my son, my brother, my father, whatever, right? And so there's a lot of exposure in art. And I think that a piece of the puzzle that art develops our own consciousness is to be able to express ourselves unabashedly, and to really put our heart on our sleeve, and to tell the world, this is who we are. Because when you're doing art, this is who you are, period. And one more thing I wanted to add about developing your own evolution through art. And, you know, people ask for examples, and the question was, how does the process of consciousness evolution happens in art? And I'll give an example that I think we can all relate. Netflix, or whatever streaming service you're using. There's so many times where we watch a show, we have our show. Remember, it's like, oh, this show that we get to the evening and this is what we're watching, right? And we think that we're wasting our time, but usually if it's a good show, we're connecting to a particular character, and there's some kind of an emotional process that is happening to us as we're watching it, because we're identifying with one of the characters or two of the characters. And usually when we no longer identify and we no longer need the stirring of our own emotions, sometimes we even leave the show. Maybe we're not going to watch the final season because something happened, we disconnected. Sometimes we will, just out of sheer enjoyment. But there's many, many times that this form of art is changing us, because it's allowing us to see something that we've never seen before. And I'll give you a small example. I've been watching this show that happens in in religious, super Orthodox religious culture. And I come from that, semi-Orthodox, religious culture. And just watching that show stirred things in me and reminded me things about my own evolution and so on and so forth. So I think this is an example that everybody can relate. One last thing about what Svia said. She said, God is also an artist. And this is so true. It's such an important point, because when you look at nature, it's like so many times art is just trying to imitate nature. When the artist is trying to paint the beautiful thing that he sees, or Diane, when you're trying to paint the lilies or the dahlias or whatever, and or when I write my story, I'm trying to bring an actual something that happened in life or in my mind happened into the paper, right? And there's something about it that when you look at the imperfection of nature, that's art. And when you're doing something, when you're creating something so perfect, in art, it's just, it looks too good. It looks it looks like, oh, that was printed in a Chinese factory, and it's just like it's duplicate. It has to look, there has to be an imperfection in it for it to really mimic nature. And I think that's also a piece of, to understand what art really is, because it expresses an underlying emotion, feeling, something through this imperfection that makes it what it is. And that's reality. Reality, creation itself is art, right? So.
Well, and I would say, the artist is capturing only a moment in time, that moment of the cherry blossoms opening. And it's that innate desire to hold on to the ephemeral, that which is constantly changing and moving and letting go. So we're kind of coming to a close. And what do you think, Erez? I have a poem. So I love the poets because the poets speak to the heart. And I was thinking I could just close us with a poem if you think we're good.
Yeah, I like that. Maybe just to ask if anybody has a comment, question, something quick that they want to say, or right, just before we closure on that. If you do, you can unmute yourself and just speak. Going once, going twice, going thrice. All right, Dan, it's all yours.
I want to say.
There you go.
I want to express my gratitude. This has been great. Thank you both.
Thank you. Michael, it's good to see you. It's good to see you. And Itzik, so nice to see you too.
Yeah, it's just a moment of just a little more personal, because there's people here, Dan, from your community in the United States, and there's people here from my community here in Israel. And, I obviously see a lot of familiar faces. Shalom Aviv, Shalom Shiri. There's so many. Dad is here. Tzvia, Shmulik, Galit, Chen, just a lot of people. So thanks for coming. And, it's so great for me that you have an opportunity to meet Diane, because I speak about Diane a lot in my talks. And, a lot of my stories, are based on life. And, I mention you. So now they have a chance to see you live and see that I haven't made you up.
Right. I do exist. And my Aunt Helen is here, and Susan and Kit, and oh my goodness, Catherine. Yeah.
Dina, Rinat. Beautiful. Thanks all for joining. So Diane, go ahead. Lior, go ahead and take it with a poem.
All right. So we're going to close with this. And I have a feeling we'll do this again because, I don't know, it's beautiful to bring together the worlds. And, there's two things before I read the poem. One is, this is a book called The Bridge. And this is an art show that was done by Americans and the Middle Easterners and Americans, and bringing together questions of faith. So anyway, that is another topic of how do we find peace and coexistence with some of the questions that we're asking, that we try to answer through the artistic process. And so here's the poem, which I think will leave you with some questions. So here it is. It's by Rilke. Be patient towards all that is unresolved in your heart. Try to love the questions themselves, like locked rooms and like books written in a very foreign tongue. Do not seek now the answers which cannot be given, because you would not be able to live them. And the point is to live everything. Live the questions now. Perhaps you will thus gradually, without noticing it, live along some distant day into the answer. So as we go, what are your questions, right? What are your questions? And I would ask you all, what is your creative expression in life, not necessarily an art form, but, you know, everything is really art. And, you know, let's stay in dialogue. Like, Erez, this has been so great to do this with you and to, you know, be with your people and to bring worlds together. Yeah. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you. Thanks, Diane. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And I'm going to make this recording available probably on my YouTube channel, or Dan, I'll give it to you and you upload it to yours. And thank you. Thanks for joining and for those who asked questions. And I hope that this was valuable to you.
Yeah.
Good night to my Israeli friends and good morning to everybody in America.
And feel free, join in at the Facebook group. I'd love to see you there if you want to play in the creative, your own creative way, and be with other like-minded people. So, yeah. All right. Bye. Bye, Helen.
Bye-bye.
And Susan and Kelly and Lior and Kit. Kit, feel better. Wow. Wow, so nice.
All right, closing us off.